And we are live. Let me start off the counter just to let the audience know that we are now live, and then we start when the counter counts down. Alrighty. Good evening, everyone. Just give me a moment. Hi, Neil. How are you?
Hi, Nalin. I'm great, and you?
I am fine. Thank you. I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking. And thank you for making the time to join us this evening. I know it's 5 p.m., right? Where you are.
Mhm. Yes, that's correct.
Past. Yeah, thank you so much for making the time past working hours. I appreciate it. And
Mm.
welcome to Safe Space. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is joining us this evening. My name is Noeline Mombi. I am a supply chain professional and the Safe Space curator and host. So, Safe Space is an open and free learning forum for us to gather and learn and share here on LinkedIn, to be seen, to be heard, and to be cared for. It is also a safe environment to share our feelings, our experiences, our opinions, our thoughts without fear of judgment or retaliation. It's primarily a community, a learning space. So this evening, we are joined by Neil Bierbaum. Thank you so much, Neil, for coming and for having us once again, for being with us once again. Neil will be leading us on the topic of leading through emergence, not emergency. And he has a whole deck prepared on it. He has a whole list of points, learning how to lead effectively in today's complex environment and discovering the 4 factors for keeping people focused when the target keeps changing. Thank you so much, Neil, for agreeing to join us
Mm.
and sharing your knowledge on this topic. I know you're doing the research on it, so thank you so much for being willing to do this for us. To the audience, Neil, let me introduce Neil. Neil, usually what I do is you remain on the platform, you become the, not me, you.
There we go. But now we lost you. I think we might just have to wait for Nolene to rejoin. I think she knocked herself off. Am I right?
And now?
There you go. You're back.
Oh, okay, I see what I did there. All right, let me introduce you, Neil. So, Neil has worked in corporate and entrepreneur environments in the areas of sales and operations. He has managed teams in high stakes, high performance environments that include magazines, publishing, and large scale website development. That is booking engines for hotel groups and global e ticketing systems. He is also a writer. He's in writing and website authoring. He is an award winning journalist and former magazine editor. He is the author of 6 books. Neil will tell us all about the books during the event. So we have a reading list for the different book clubs that we are in. And he has numerous websites and online self coaching programs. He's the online startup founder and internet service company MD. And today, with nearly 2 decades of experience, he specializes in coaching clients towards the practical application of mindful self-awareness for optimal performance. A result which he calls personal effectiveness. So we are going to be learning a bit about that this evening. He also offers an integrated leader and team effectiveness solution where he works with leaders to improve performance by building trust within teams. So that is Neil's introduction.
Mm.
Thank you so much, Neil.
Great. Thank you, Nolene. That's a great introduction. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Nolene, for the opportunity and the invitation to make this presentation. Sounds like a great concept you've got there of safe spaces, getting where people can ask things that they wouldn't normally ask. And yeah, just a heads up front, I've been a little bit ill. I've had a bit of bronchitis. So if you saw me sipping a cup of tea, it's because Nolene recommended lemon and ginger and honey, which I took her advice and it really works. So I'm just doing that to manage any potential coughs that might occur. So excuse me if that comes up. And
Sorry.
yeah, so the background Nolene shared, just to give you some context. So I began my career, I won't go all the way to the beginning, but I was a journalist, a magazine editor. And when magazine business moved online, I followed that trend and trained myself in online development and ended up running an IT services company and developing an internet startup. In parallel to that, I've always been interested in personal development. I learned meditation at an early age in my 20s, and I've been practicing probably for some 30 years and understanding the real philosophies behind the meditations, not just practicing it to help me relax, for example. And there's some very powerful and important philosophies there, and along with my coach training. So that is all fed into the kind of program that I have here and the model that I've developed, which helps us to lead through turbulent times in increasing complexity by leveraging emergence rather than treating everything as an emergency, which is the title of the talk. And I'll start to share my slides there. You can see that on the title. Let me just make sure that that's going up. It'll come up in a second. Oh, it's that one, that one, that one. There we go. Do I need to? I don't know if there's another button I need to click. There's the share button. Got it. All right.
Right.
And so can you see that? Good. So yes, and probably grammatically leading through emergence. I'm trying to find the best phrasing for that because it's leading by leveraging the emergence that happens naturally and not treating everything as an emergency. I hope that is able to come through. And then we, illustrated pictorially for you. And one of the things, maybe what helped me to develop this was in the magazine business, you have very strict deadlines. So there's a fixed deadline, and somehow we always manage to achieve that deadline. But then when I moved into the IT space, I noticed that deadlines were very sort of loose arrangements, and you got scope creep, and things were never really delivered on time or to the same level of quality, always bugs and everything. And I kind of looked at these two and I was like, okay, what's going on here? Why are we so able because in magazines, if you miss your deadline, your magazines don't go on the truck. They don't hit the supermarket shelves at the end of the month. They don't go the next day. They go 2 weeks' time. You lose half your revenue. So the consequence was massive. Whereas in the IT space, maybe there's a little penalty or nothing at all. And so there wasn't that consequence. And I thought, how can we translate this level of commitment and achievement into the more flexible space of IT, which is a more agile environment? And it was thinking about that along with the coaching I was doing that led me, and bringing in the mindfulness training that led me to this model. So that's just giving you some context. And I'll unpack that in more detail as we go along. So if we consider the current business environment, we've all heard the term VUCA, and we understand what that means, I'm sure, most of us. It originated actually out of an American military context where they said that the kind of scenarios that they face are very much more like this now than standard warfare. And then it evolved as business tends to borrow its lexicon from military warfare. It naturally picked up on this phrase as well: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity being key features of the environment that we face. And what that means is that we can't run things so much through process anymore. We have to find a more flexible way of managing on the ground in the moment. And that's where emergence comes in. If we have a look at the VUCA acronym and look at those words, and we try and pull out what is the common factor between them, and we see there that the words that I've put there are ones that I pulled out of the dictionary that are placed next to those words. So you can just have a look at them there. and see if you can start to pull out what is the theme, the common theme for yourself that you recognize in those, between those four words. And I'll give you my version, and my version is that it's about change. And so all of this is about being unable to predict and control what's going to happen because of the variability and the uncertainty and the number of variables, the speed of the variables, the meaning of the variables, and so on. And that word change kind of strikes fear into the heart of many people. I've got the local coffee shop here, the Seattle coffee shops here in Johannesburg. They've got this little cup where they collect change, if you pay by cash, which I don't know if many people do these days. But they've got this little sticker on the side, and it says, "Fear change, leave it with us." And I love that. I actually wanted to take a picture and stick it on my presentation here. But it's kind of the thing, and in organizations, people are always very nervous when there's change. And yet the irony of it is that change is pretty much going on all the time. In fact, we say, well, the only constant is change. But in fact, it's even more than that. We say that as though life is some static thing and change pulls up in a car and gets out and crashes the party. But it doesn't really happen like that. It's more that life is change and change is life. They're one and the same thing. If you sit and you observe, when I talked about learning meditation, the one meditation I did is Vipassana meditation, Vipassana. And you learn that through, get this, 10 days, silent retreat, sitting for 10 hours a day, 2 hours at a time, 5 sessions, where you sit and you observe reality through very strict instructions and, observe what's happening in your body and your mind and the reality. And this word keeps coming from the instructor, and he says anicca, which means impermanence. In other words, notice how everything changes. And it's true. Sounds come and go, temperatures come and go, the breeze comes and goes, the pain in your body comes and goes, itches, thoughts, feelings, everything comes and goes. And you realize that there is nothing that stands still and then change happens. Change is life, and life is change. And that's really where what feeds into the essence of the theme of emergence. So change is already happening. And if we look at it like that, and also as a service provider to organizations, often I see, you put in a proposal. I don't know how many times it's happened. Yeah, but we can't do it now because we're going through a restructuring. And then when that's finished, there's another restructuring. There's more restructuring than not restructuring in organizations, I notice. And so change is not really the issue. The issue is something more than that. There's something deeper that we fear. And in fact, it's we can say that if change was the issue, then people would change. They would make a change. But very often people don't change. They stay in the same situation for years and years, complaining about it, the same relationship, the same job. They complain and they don't actually make the change. And why would that be? Instead of just giving it up, they'd rather stay there, try and force the other person to change than have them go through the change. And I reflected on this and pulled in some of the philosophies that I talked about underlying the meditations and so on. And if we look at it, what we really see is that what people are afraid of is their inability to control what's going to happen at the end, as change progresses. In other words, to give it a simple phrase, the inability to control outcomes. And this is where we start to see what the problem is, because what drives us mad is not being able to perfectly predict the future and control outcomes to exactly what it is that we want. Because, of course, we know best. We know what needs to happen in this situation, and we'll tell you. You just ask me, I'll tell you what should happen here. Don't you think all politics is driven by that? All, even within teams as well, within organizations, is the people having an agenda. When there's politics, what is it? It's people having an agenda. And what is an agenda? It's a desire to control an outcome towards what I want, what suits me, what I say is best, whatever that might be. And so that's really what's going on all the time. And in fact, even if you look at our television series, what's the main driver of the story? Like here's Succession, the series Succession, which was on Netflix, fantastic series, but the entire series was driven by the attempt to control the outcome of who would take over from the old man, Logan Roy, when he retired or passed on. If you think about Game of Thrones, the entire series was driven by the attempt to control the outcome of who would sit on the Iron Throne. And I hope you enjoy series, by the way, and watch them. These are some of the more popular ones, so I hope you have, and they make sense to you. But the point is, all the drama in these series is driven by this attempt to control outcomes. And that's really what's going on at the end of that VUCA line that is troubling us. And here we're going to link this into the point of emergency and contrast that with emergence. And just so you know, from there, what I'm going to do is I'll take you into what does the neurology, the neuroscience say about it? Then what are the assumptions that we're making that lead us to treat things as an emergency and to lead as though it's an emergency versus as leveraging emergence? And then I'll take you into those 4 key elements for leading through emergence. So it'll be a very practical outcome at the end. So the question becomes, how do you react when things don't go your way? And it's pretty common and predictable that we have this experience, which is the amygdala hijack. So the amygdala is that tiny little piece at the center of the brain, which is our fight and flight radar. And when it experiences something that it regards as threat, i.e. change, i.e. something where I can't control the outcome, I feel unsafe, and then I go into that fight or flight response. And often when I introduce this in different contexts in workshops, I point out and I use this. So I say, when things are not going our way, we react, we start treating the situation like it's a matter of life or death, like it's the end of the world. And the conversation in our brain usually goes something like this: if this happens, I'll get into trouble, I'll lose my job, my children will suffer, and I'll die. And the kind of laugh I get from that is often tells me that there's a little more truth to this than it just being a flippant comment. And when I sit and I interview people, they say, yeah, that does go on for them in the back of their minds. We don't really think about it. And so that leads to this automatic reaction. Fortunately, our brain is a little more developed than that, and we have this other area in the front there called the prefrontal cortex, which is the more recently developed part of the brain. And that's where we're able to govern. I call it the governor part of the brain, where we're able to notice our reaction and make a decision. In that space of awareness, we are then able to choose. Do I want to react in this way, or do I want to choose a different response? And so we have that distinction in language. We talk about a reaction and a response. The key indicator of a reaction, by the way, is that you have no choice. You find yourself doing something. So when you get angry, when you take something personally, when you start to treat something like it's an emergency, it's not like you plan for that and you decide, okay, at 10 o'clock today when this happens, I'm going to start treating it like an emergency. You just find yourself. Usually at the end of the day, you go, oh dear, maybe I overreacted a bit there. And usually that's accompanied with some kind of a maybe regret, or I wish I could have done it differently. So we can see there's no choice, whereas response is indicated by choice. So that's when I'm aware in the moment that this is a possible reaction. This is the way I usually do things. This is what my coach told me, or that I discovered through my coaching, that I get a little bit anxious here. Let me think about it, choose a different response. So that part, the response part, happens in the prefrontal cortex. And what they've found, actually, interestingly, is that long-term meditators, there's a book in 2017 by Daniel Goleman, who's the founder, who coined the term emotional intelligence. And he also, by the way, had done a Vipassana meditation in the early 70s when he was younger. And he then, excuse me, teamed up with a guy, Richard Davidson, excuse me, and they wrote a book called The Science of Meditation, where they evaluated all the studies that have been done on meditation to see if their claims were true. And they found that, yes, indeed, long-term Vipassana meditators, for example, had more connections in the brain between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And so were better able to control their reactions in exercises that they were given. And that is, excuse me, that's not good. So there was, that's ultimately at the deeper level of mindfulness training. Excuse me, just give me a minute.
I'm sorry, Neil. All right.
Okay, let's try again. So then from there, I want to take you into some quotes, and we're going to enter this from a slightly different angle. And then, pick up on those assumptions that I talked about earlier. I think I'm over that now. So here's something that Carl Jung said. He said that all modern people assume that there is nothing that exists that they have not made up. We think we have invented everything physical, that nothing would happen if we did not do it. That is our basic idea, and it is an extraordinary assumption. So if you think about, if you were to beat your own heart, breathe your own lungs, work your own spleen, well, you'd probably be dead in 10 minutes, right? Because you'd be so busy worrying about all the other stuff that you have to control and on your phone, fix those things. Fortunately, your autonomic nervous system takes care of all those things for you without needing your attention on them. But despite that evidence, despite the fact that we don't control our own body and so on, we still think we can control events outside of ourselves. Like when we send that angry email, we think, well, I know exactly how they'll respond. They'll come back to me and say, you were right, I'm sorry, but it never happens that way, does it? Or you prepare and you send out this job proposal or put in a job application and it doesn't go your way. And then on another day, it happens spontaneously. There's no preparation and suddenly you get the job. And so we can see that there's a lot happening that we're not in control of. There's a lot less in control than we like to think. But we don't gather that evidence very accurately. We tend to keep believing that it's up to us, that we must do it, and that we're in control of a lot more than we really are. So that's one thing to consider as we lead into this theme a little bit deeper. And we're just kind of entering into it from various different angles here, and then we'll arrive at a central point on emergence. So here are the quotes. It's by Peter Senge, who's a leadership and management guru and who coined the term or brought the term into business called personal mastery, which is really about people who are better able to respond rather than react. So they become more self-aware in various areas and they're more responsive than reactive. And when people develop that level of awareness and responsiveness, they tend to, he says, see reality as an ally, not as an enemy. So remember, we're talking about change, and we've said that life or reality is change, and what we're worried about is things not going our way. So when we see reality as an ally, we're talking about reality being things changing and not going our way. Immediately we say, well, that sounds like an enemy, something I have to fix. But what if that was an ally? There's that pop psychology, new age saying that says things are happening for me, not to me. And although it may sound a little breezy, it's a perfect expression of this. And we tend to think, well, that doesn't really apply. It's just a nice pipe dream. But what if you had to really test that? So I have a personal experience with that, and that is around in my own business development. So I realized at some stage that, in the coaching business, a lot of the business comes through networking, and I'm a bit of an introvert, and I like, as I explained earlier, I like to write, I like to do tech, work on my own and do that kind of thing. So I decided, well, instead of trying to compete with people who are much better at networking, let me realign my marketing strategy and do it through building technology, good website platforms, and so on that can attract the same business, which I did. And it started to work very well for me. But then came a time when it suddenly went quiet. It was early in COVID, and COVID wasn't the reason, because COVID, people could do coaching and stuff online, and there was plenty of investment in that. So it actually, my business surged in the beginning, and then suddenly it just went off a cliff. And I was sitting there and I was like, how interesting. Haven't had an inquiry for like a couple of weeks, and this other work was finishing, nothing new was emerging, and I was like, okay. So now, if I was to treat that as an enemy, as an emergency, as something to be fixed, what would I have done? I would have gone, oh dear, maybe I have to start phoning people and, doing all sorts of things. But I had put a strategy in place and it had been working. And so I looked at this and said, well, what if this is in my favor in some way? And I realized that I had made this commitment to write a book, and I had not managed to find the time. And I thought, well, while I'm waiting for things to emerge here, let me sit down and write this book, which I then did. I took some time, and a week, and then another week, and I was going, wow, this is fantastic. I've got all this time. I'm writing this book in 3 weeks. But I did start getting a bit nervous, like, okay, this is the longest I've ever been without, with such a big gap. And I carried on. And in about the 5th week, when there were moments when I was like, okay, maybe this is an emergency, suddenly I got an inquiry through my website, and it turned into a very significant piece of business, a piece of corporate business that lasted for a couple of years. It became one of my biggest clients, was fantastic work, and it started just as I was finished writing the draft of that book. And for the next few years, as a result of that business and other business that started coming in again, I did not have the time to write. I did have the time to edit pieces of it, but I would not have had the time to write. So that's an example of how one could see reality, things not going my way, as an ally, not as an enemy, where you align with what's happening as against fighting against it. So that's pointing us into what leading through emergence might look like versus treating it as an emergency. The interesting thing about this, though, this is an important point here, is that we always tend to see that in retrospect. We go, that's the lesson. And they say, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, but it was the best thing that happened to me. And emergence, leading through emergence, is about recognizing it when it's happening. Because if we don't recognize when it's happening, we then treat it like an emergency, and we never get to the benefits where we're able to say, this is the results of leading with emergence. So we never gather the evidence. We never build a case for it. We just keep reverting to treating it as an emergency. So the key with emergence, leading through emergence, as you'll see, it's kind of scary. It's risky. It takes a lot of presence and a lot of steadiness of mind, a lot of some faith, and staying the course, and then gathering the evidence afterwards that it works. And of course, there's times when you're wrong. However, there's times when you treat it as an emergency and you create the very problem you were hoping to avoid. For example, the sale deal isn't coming through, you become too aggressive, and then you lose the sale for that reason. So that's an example of where treating it as an emergency also doesn't work for you. So then I'm going to throw a big spanner in the work and give you this quote. And that says, I tend to this is from a chap called Rajat Gupta, who was the CEO of McKinsey. And he says, I tend to let things sort themselves out. 9 problems out of 10 go away if you don't address them. You have to deal with the 10th. I often don't address things until I have to. And then he says, a certain amount of inertia is more useful in solving a problem than is premature and aggressive action. Well, isn't that interesting? Because in the environment I work with, the corporates and the teams I work with, that's very much not the case. And so what I often do, and I'm going to do it with you now, is I present this, the control continuum. So where are you? How many problems out of 10 do you step in to solve or do something? So a 1 would be the chilled Zen person on the left. But if you're stepping in all the time, thinking that everything is up to you and you've got to fix and solve the problems, then you're more like that guy on the right and you're closer to 10. So I'd be very interested for you just to reflect on that, throw your scores into the chat, and let's see what comes up. Nolene, if you are able to see those, maybe you can share them with me.
Okay. Starting with myself, I think it's 9 out of 10. I want to solve them
Wow.
all. And pretty much. Just waiting for more feedback to come in. Give me a moment. And responses are coming in on inbox, not on chat.
Oh dear. Okay.
You were right about the sevens. You had predicted sevens.
Okay. Okay.
You were right about that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I'm not alone. There's another 9.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so we are averaging 9 plus 9, 18 plus 7. What is that? 26. What?
It's about
Is it?
8.
An average of about 8. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I would expect. 7 to 9 is usually the range that this lands in. And so we're very much, speaking to the right audience. And hopefully what we have to say has value. And of course, often our response is like, does that mean I'm doing it wrong, or must I flip to the opposite? And the answer isn't always that. A lot of this can be contextual. Different environments require different things, and we'll have a look at that. And it's more of a both and. It's like looking at what's appropriate in the situation, and also more about, remember, that reaction. So when we react, we're treating it automatically like it's an emergency. We haven't thought about it. We haven't tested anything else. Whereas the response is to test and try different things. And that's really what this is about. It's about for you to start to look at situations and go, can I look at this differently? Can I recalibrate and decide which ones need my attention, as the quote says, rather than simply assuming that everyone does. So I'm going to take you now a little bit into getting into the nuts and bolts of this and help you with that self-awareness and having a look at what are the assumptions at either end that we make that hold us at either end of the control continuum. So there's certain assumptions that we make that lead me to think that this is an emergency and I've got to treat it as an emergency. And then there's a different assumption we can make that can help us to step back and look at it differently. So let's have a look at this. When we treat change as an emergency, we are the first assumption is that we know best. Of course, that's why I'm the leader. I'm expected to know, and I've been through all this training and years of experience. So what do you expect? I know, we know, and we have the answer, and we're convinced. And so that's our core assumption. And we really do feel that pressure as leaders that we have to know. And in a corporate environment, we're expected to know, we're expected to have answers, we're expected to produce action and decisions. And it's very much what's demanded of us. So we have to assume that. And sometimes behind the scenes, we're kind of not that sure, And so we'll have a look just now at what the alternative assumption would be that would lead to change through emergence, or treating change as emergence. The other assumption we make is that our plan is right. So we really believe that, like I said, when I do this, this is the consequence I'm going to get. Our plan is right. It's going to have this outcome, and we're going to stick to it no matter what. At the moment, globally, there's an interesting movement because Facebook, and this relates to my experience in the media IT space. So Facebook has taken over a huge chunk of the world's advertising, Facebook and Google. And so the newspapers that usually would have got that advertising now have to put their stuff on Facebook to get audience, but then Facebook is the one with all the traffic and that gets the advertising. So in various countries, it started in Canada, then moved to Australia, then South Africa is having its own go at it at the moment. they said, okay, Facebook and Google, you've got to put in some money into a pot that we're going to share with those news organizations because you're benefiting from carrying news in your feed. And so Google said, okay, sure. They paid in Canada the $100 million a year or whatever they started. But Facebook said, tough. We're not going to put any advertising. I mean, we're not going to allow news anymore on our Canadian feeds. We're just going to stop. And so now those media outlets have lost the money and they've lost the audience. They've had like up to 40% drops in audience, 60%. And so there's a unintended consequence where somebody treated something in a particular way. We know best. Our plan is right. We went out and implemented, and it backfired horribly. And so maybe there was a different approach that they could have taken there. I'm not saying I know what it is, but it's certainly an example of where we gung-ho and we think we're doing the right thing and we don't see the unintended consequences. There again, so it's the belief that we're in control of what happens, that our decisions lead to certain outcomes. The other assumption we make is that deviations are wrong or a problem or something to be fixed or put right. I gave that earlier. When we treat reality as an enemy, we then are treating it as though any deviation from course is a problem to be fixed. And we'll explore the alternatives just now. The other assumption, as per Carl Jung's quote, is that it's all up to me. Nothing would happen if I didn't do it. And don't we all really believe that? In leadership as well, we try to demonstrate. It's all up to me. And then this isn't so much of an assumption. Well, it is the assumption. It's the assumption that because I can't sleep at night, I must be doing something, which is a false assumption. And I'll explain why in a minute. So what we can do when we recognize ourselves in emergency mode is come back and look for this assumption that we're making. So what is the assumption that I'm making about this situation and my approach to the situation that I'm holding on to that I could evaluate? And then we have a look at what are the assumptions that I would need to translate those into that would enable me to treat the situation or the change as an emergence, not an emergency. And so we'd naturally want to say, oh, well, if we know best, then we want to flip into the opposite. I don't know anything at all, or flip it into its opposite. But the interesting piece, what comes out of here, from we know best, the alternative assumption is we're open to learn. And what we find is that every situation, if we give up trying to control this, and I've done this exercise with many people where I say, okay, well, what if you had to give that up? And they go, well, then this might happen. And then, and then that might happen. And where they always end up on that ladder is at, well, then we'd learn. Without fail, we always end up, when we give up trying to control and predict, we realize that we'd be open to learn. And I'll put that phrase in there, how fascinating. How fascinating is just a nice way of switching your mind into curiosity, open to learn mode. Because when something's not going your way, like I gave the example of work not coming in for a few weeks, new inquiries, and then if I could get anxious about it, or I could go, how fascinating. I see that there's a 2-week gap. What does that mean? So immediately my mind just opens up. How fascinating. You can see it just relaxes you. It opens you. And some of my clients, the whole organization uses this phrase now. Whenever there's a crisis, you hear in the boardroom, how fascinating. And everybody goes, oh, yes, there we go. And so it really is a powerful, just like a opening key to switch you into what is there to learn here, and shift that assumption. Our plan is right. Well, it's not to switch to our plan is wrong. This is not about turning to opposites. Our plan is one half of the story. So in sport, for example, and there's that series on DSTV in South Africa and probably, I'm not sure about the rest of Africa, I'm sure at the moment, called Chasing the Sun 2, which is the story of the Springboks winning the 2023 World Cup. And there's some good examples in there where they went into a game, they had their plan, and some of the players are saying, you've got your plan, but when you're on the field, there's a whole different thing going on. They've got their plan, and sometimes theirs is working, sometimes it's yours. And so to think that our plan is right against reality, with a sports team, it's easier because they're there in green jerseys in front of you or black jerseys or whatever. But reality is a little bit more abstracty. So we kind of, it's less visible. But there is stuff happening and other people are making decisions. And so our plan is one half of the story. It doesn't mean it's wrong. We can stick to it 100%. The way a sports person runs on the field, 100% committed to execute their plan, but then has to make adjustments immediately and has to absorb the pressure and then come back. So the way I summarize that is what I call making happen and letting happen. So sometimes with my example earlier, website, putting it out. So I had made it happen. I made stuff happen, and I was spending my dollars on AdWords or whatever I was, and the other activities I was doing, making happen. But then when the responses weren't coming, I went into letting happen. Like, what wants to happen in this situation? I didn't try to then turn up the volume and push harder and do more of the same. And it was opening up the other side of the coin. The next assumption, going from we're in control to we're part of what happens. And again, instead of, this is a very, very key one. And it's funny because our religious beliefs kind of support us in this. We'll say things like, it's God's will, or let go, let God, inshallah, things like that. But we kind of, maybe some people are really able to bring that into their business life, but generally we leave that for, Sunday or whatever, for religion and for other parts of our life. But in business, we don't give over to that. We give over to science, data, and results, and decisions, and action, and so on. And it's all up to me and control and proving that I can do something about it. And so we kind of lose track of that. But this is a real opportunity to bring our spirituality into the workplace and recognize this, because we're part of what happens. Is kind of like asking the question, what wants to happen? What's the bigger picture here that wants to emerge? And the story I've got from this also comes from sports. So there was a guy, his name was Warren Whiteley. He was captain of the Lions rugby team in Gauteng here in Johannesburg. And he got selected. He was leading a very successful team, doing very well. And he got selected as the Springbok captain for the national team. But then unfortunately he got injured. So he wasn't able to play as captain and then he got injured again, and he got injured again. And each time they had a stand-in captain. Then he finally got to play, but then he got injured again. And now they were approaching the World Cup 2019, so they had to appoint a permanent captain. So they then chose Siya Kolisi, who, if you read the biography of Rassie, the coach, he said there was nothing racial or intentional about it. It was the best person for the job at the time. But it turned into a significant thing for South Africa, for getting Black people's faith and buy-in in the system, being able to identify with the game, the story it told about South Africa, the meaning it gave to the win in 2019 when they won the World Cup, and the celebrations that happened, and it really changed the dynamic. So if you were Warren Whiteley in that situation asking, what about me, trying to control what happens, you'd be very miserable and treating it like an emergency. But if you were open and wise enough to listen and to ask what wants to happen in this situation, you might be able to see something like that. And again, often we get that only in retrospect, but hopefully sometimes we can get it in advance or while it's happening. So deviations are a problem, something to be fixed, an enemy to be overcome. What if deviations are opportunities to discover a better solution or to discover what wants to happen? So here, I always advocate using the phrase, nothing's wrong. So when something's wrong and you recognize yourself treating it like something's wrong, just switch to nothing's wrong. What if, ask yourself a question, what if nothing's wrong? And then wait and see what emerges, either as a thought or wait and see what happens. So you were rushing to a meeting and you realized, and you were printing at the last minute, a printer jam. So now something's wrong because you're late for this most important meeting. And then you get in the car and you get there, the printer takes you 5 minutes to fix, and you get there and on the way you see there's an accident that must have happened just 5 minutes before, you avoid it. So nothing's wrong. Just a simple example, but there's a lot of that, if we look for it, that we can leverage. And although we know that and we say, yes, I've seen this, but when the crisis hits, we don't usually leverage this in the big moments. And sometimes that's when it can have really value, where it can really have value is in those big moments. We go, no, surely we can't treat this as though nothing's wrong, but give it a try. That big client that I spoke about was pharmaceutical, and they were involved in some major drama around vaccines and COVID and that. And they applied this during that, and it really helped them to get through that without creating more problems and more drama than was necessary. And they used this principle in that very extreme situation to navigate through that. So I've seen it happen in critical, high consequence, high stakes situations. The other one is the assumption life happens, that it's all up to me. So what happens if I observe that life happens despite me? And in case you're wondering, as a test, sit back and do nothing and see what happens. Ha ha. Firstly, if you sit and do 10 hours a day of meditation for 10 days, you see that life happens without you. Secondly, you can look at it in the projects around you and look at, how much do you condition your environment to that you're always the one doing it, so why should they do it? Take some of those projects and sit back, let people know that they need to be done, put them out there and create a bit of space and see if somebody picks it up and see what happens to it. Sometimes the problems go away, sometimes they change, sometimes somebody steps in and does it, but something will happen in that space. That's the piece. If we go back to that Carl Jung quote, we think it only happens because of me, but no. If I don't do it, stuff happens. And just now we'll talk about how do you create an environment where we encourage that stuff to happen. That's the next piece that I'll be talking about. Finally, the assumption that because I can't sleep at night, it must be that I'm doing something. Well, worrying just makes it feel like I'm doing something. So that letting happen is not unrealistic, it's realistic. Give it some space, observe and gather evidence from your experience and build a case for not having to be the one to be doing something and not having to worry about stuff, because stuff can happen without you or differently from how you expect, or it can happen differently and be okay, and so on. Good. So I'm now going to take you through these 4 key elements for leading through emergence. So this kind of brings it together, and this is like sort of practical applications. And let's have a look at these. So the first one is clarity. And by clarity, we mean everybody knowing exactly what is needed, what the goal is, what the outcome is. So this is, remember, this comes from magazine environment when there was clear deadline. On this day, the magazine had to be in the truck. Therefore, on this day, it had to be at the printer. There was no compromise. Clarity, that's 100% clear. It was not vague. So what is the present desired outcome? Because we realize that this may change. It may be flexible. What are the non-negotiables and how non-negotiable are they? So in the magazine business, your deadline is your deadline, and it's very non-negotiable, because if you're not on those trucks, you lose half your revenue. But in an IT space, well, your delivery deadline is, we say it's not negotiable, but the consequences are not as great. So the question becomes, how do you make intangibles matter more? So the print deadline is a tangible because it's physical products that have to move. In an IT space where it's less tangible, sometimes, we can treat them, it's a little more abstract. So how do you ratchet up identify what the non-negotiables are? Because not everything can be non-negotiable. The key non-negotiables. What is the overall purpose? Make sure that everybody understands the purpose and what are the values. If we look at the sports example, so, and we're talking about what is the why. Some teams, well, they just want to play to enjoy the game. They want to entertain. Another product might be to make life easier. Or in the pharmaceutical, it's about saving lives. So different purposes there create different levels. And then, coming back to the sport thing, an interesting one there might be like some teams want to win the World Cup, so they don't mind losing games in between. but other teams want to be the number one, which means they must win all the games in between. What are the values that drive the decisions that we make? And what are the critical decision-making variables or factors? That is the other one that comes up here. And what do I mean by that? By that we mean people need to know the analogy that has emerged from this is, let's say I want somebody to paint a wall red, and I send him out to buy paint, but he finds, is it the color match? Is it how fast it dries? Or is it that it's waterproof? What is the key factor? Because now, and if he doesn't know, he's got to come all the way back, ask, and go again. So I need to, as a leader, communicate my key thinking so that people understand what my critical decision-making factors are so that they can execute in the field. And this becomes more and more important as we move into more collaborative environments. So another example of this would be when the detective gets told to drop the case because the police chief has a higher agenda. Letting people know what that agenda is, what's really going on, what's the strategy that drives the decision-making. And that links back to values as well, understanding what the core values are. So if you're out there in the field, you can relate back to the values. You don't have to relate back to processes and procedures and rules. If you're from Volvo and you're representing Volvo out there, well, safety is your core value. So and you can relate everything back to that. So communicating that, being clear on those factors is the first element. The second one is the level of commitment. Is everyone committed? And by the way, commitment is binary. It's all or nothing. There's no half commitment. And the commitment thing, if you look at the magazine thing, there's a demonstration of commitment and the impact of commitment. And when you're committed, this is so important, because if you think about wanting to climb Kilimanjaro and you hear people talking about it at a dinner party, but you're not involved, the next day you wake up and you think, oh, that's interesting. Nothing really changes. But if you and your best friend have committed to climb Kilimanjaro by the end of the year, the next day you wake up and you have whole new thoughts in your mind. What do I need? What's it going to cost? Everything that's missing becomes apparent for you. And that's what was the difference between the magazine deadline and the IT deadline, was the level of commitment. In the rugby field, you see the team, South Africa won their last 3 games in the last World Cup by 1 point each. That's pure commitment. The Springbok coach, Jacques Nienaber, calls it superior discontent. Their team had superior discontent with somebody crossing their line. They were more committed. If you got 2 teams that are equally skilled, the one that is committed to win will win. But the key with commitment is how it brings up what's missing. Because remember the Kilimanjaro example I gave? When you're just talking about it, you don't have any new thoughts, but when you're committed, everything that's missing rises to the surface. So this is key. So your job, if people aren't picking up problems, is to check, are the goals clear, those things, and is everyone committed? And what does accountability to that commitment look like? Is it spread between all team members? Can people challenge each other? And here comes the third element, which is presence. By presence, I mean, is everyone, especially the leader, present and paying attention? Present enough? And an example, when I was developing this model, I was with a friend and we were at a lunch party, and the host was this famous or very well-to-do sculptor who created sculptures, and a lot of his stock had been damaged. And the reason was that his shelves had collapsed. He had put up new shelves and they had collapsed. And I immediately said he wasn't present enough in his business. And the friend said to me, you're right. He was traveling a lot, and I think he has become quite bored and complacent. And that was 100%, because if he had been present when those shelves were going up, he would have seen something was missing, and it would have come to the surface. When I was in the magazine business, I could walk across the floor and I could see that headline doesn't look right. That picture doesn't look right. Why is that person working on that thing? I needed to have a level of presence that things would rise to the surface. And if everybody else was paying enough attention, they too would catch things. as a result of the clarity and the commitment. So is one present enough? Well, yes, if you're catching things in time, but no, if you're not. And this is the key thing, because so important is often when things go wrong, and this is here where the emergency thinker, when things go wrong, we think, damn it, what happened? Why did that happen? We have to launch an inquiry. People have to put out a report, check the processes, add something new to the process. But the fact is, we caught it, and we caught it in time before it became a crisis. If you put in 7 different processes, something else will emerge that is a problem, and then you'll want to do a report on that. I've coached teams where, while they're busy trying to solve the problem, the manager's making them write a report on what went wrong. So they're less effective. And I say to them, well, you're catching it in time. Every time you're catching it in time. So your system is working because your people, the goals are clear, people are committed, there's presence, so stuff is emerging. And when it emerges, you catch it. So is there a need to review the process? Sometimes, maybe, but not with such aggression. You can look in the background and go, are we catching things enough? If we're catching 99% of things, then we're probably doing these things right. And it's not an emergency. And part of presence means is everyone awake and listening to themselves, listening to each other, listening to what wants to happen, asking themselves those questions, responding instead of reacting. And the final one is trust. So here we have a particular form of trust, meaning it's safe to bring things up. Because if I'm going to bring up a problem and we're going to address it, I need to know that it's safe, that nobody's going to hold it against me, that it's safe to make a mistake, safe to hold each other accountable, safe to point out problems when people go off track. And that usually means putting the team or the product first. And does everybody know that? Is there an agreement that nothing here is personal, it's about the team or the product first? I found that when I worked on the magazine. I trained in London in a very, very intense environment where people would get together for these ideas meetings and throw out ideas. And you couldn't take it personally if your idea just got rejected. You had to, trust that it was all about the product. Your work could get slated in front of other people. You had to know that the team came first. Rassi in the Springbok team gives us feedback in front of everybody. So it's not personal because the team comes first. It's understanding that. And so my experience is putting these 4 factors together with those sub-elements involved and paying attention to them is the key to managing and leading through emergence by leveraging what wants to emerge instead of treating everything as an emergency. And I think I've taken a little longer than I had planned, but I'm happy to take any questions if there are. And I'm leaving you with that quote just to think about that emergence is happening all around us. If you're struggling to see it, well, it's that very thing you're fighting against, what you call problems, the stuff that needs to be fixed, changed, directed according to your will or perfected. Try to treat that as an emergence instead of an emergency.
Emergency. Thank you. Thank you so much, Neil, for sharing all this and sharing your research with us. It's very eye-opening. I think there's a bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, of mindset shift that needs to happen on what our knee-jerk reactions usually are when we are faced with new realities versus, like you're saying, just take a pause and reframe it and ask yourself in a different way what's going on. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I'll go into the questions that have been asked. The latest one that has come in being the last element that you are showing on leading through emergence on trust. Is this the same as psychological safety?
Yes, very much, I would say. I use the term colleagueship, where colleague means a kind of professional friendship. So we know enough about each other personally, we care about each other, we have that openness, but we're still professional. So yes, colleagueship was coined by Peter Senge. Psychological safety has become the sort of the current term for it.
Okay, all right. Colleagueship. That's a new one. I've learned another new thing during this session. Thank you for sharing that. The other question is, what are the key differences in approach and mindset? Sorry, let me just get it again. Between handling situations as emergencies and leading through emergence. I
So,
think this is okay. Let you take it. Sorry.
so just start it again from the top, please, so I can hear the whole thing.
Okay. What are the key differences in approach and mindset between
Mm,
handling situations as emergencies and
mm,
leading
mm,
through
mm,
emergence?
mm. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think point back to the assumption. So it really is, or even all the way back to react versus respond.
Mm,
So the first thing we have to do, the key is being aware of when I'm treating it as an emergency. And that unlocks the whole process because then I become aware. I can think in that space. I can check my assumptions. I can make a new assumption. I can go to those four key elements and check what I need to do. But the first point is awareness. So, how do you become aware? Well, probably you've got one or two key reactions, behaviors, thoughts, uh, things that you say, things that you do, things that you think, things that you feel. So, or physical. So you might get your heart rate goes up. You get sweaty palms, or you get irritated. I had someone in the team the other day. She says she starts banging her mouse. Well,
mm,
she knows when she bangs her mouse, that's the key. Um, so there's probably one or two key things you do, or a phrase that you use, like "I've been through this before," or you've got some key phrase. When you hear yourself saying that,
mm.
recognize that that's your indicator, and then just pull back and then start that whole process.
Oh, like phrases like I know how to do this. I've done it before.
Hmm.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So, challenges. Okay. What are the common challenges that leaders may face when shifting from an emergency driven approach to one focused on emergence, and how can they overcome them?
That's an excellent question because yes, as I've said, in the corporate environment, we're expected to know the answer, to provide the answer, to be decisive, to show that we're doing something.
Mm,
All of that is expected of us, and that's the normal approach. So if you try to do this, depending on what's happening at the level above you, you may not always be able to pull it off. You can do it in your context. People might feel a bit insecure. You might need to explain to them why you're doing it, but certainly start in some safer areas and experiment and build your own belief that it can work, and then start to influence outwards. Then start to show other people this is how you've done things, this is what's working, and see if you
mm.
can influence. But that interface, that is a challenge in the corporate environment because not everybody is thinking like this or wants to.
Okay. So, if I just follow up your response to the next question that I think ties into what you've just said, and it's around organizational culture. And the question is, how can leaders cultivate an organizational culture that supports emergence rather than constantly reacting to emergencies?
Again, a very good question. And it has to come from the top. So, if you're somewhere in the organization and you're influencing this, great. Uh, See if you can spread the conversation and, yeah, talk to the right people to get it brought in at the right level of the organization.
Mm,
Certainly, from any position you can lead, you can influence. But if you want it organization wide, it needs to come from the top.
top
And the
down.
key element is that trust or psychological safety. You have to build that. Um,
Mm,
and then you can allow this to go. But because remember, there's that link between agendas, trying to
mm,
control outcomes, which is the opposite of trust. If everyone's got an agenda, there's no trust. So
mm.
when we build trust, it's because people are giving up their agenda for the shared objective, and that's more conducive to an emergent style of leadership than an emergency style.
Okay. It makes sense. Totally makes sense. A cascade from top down.
Hmm.
All right.
Hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that. Then the next one, gosh, there are quite a number, and we are 4 minutes past time. Can I request for 5 more minutes of your time,
Sure.
Neil? Okay.
I'm having fun.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much
I'm
for being
loving the
so great.
questions. Yeah.
Okay. Next one is on resilience, and I'd actually been asked a similar question during the day. I'm so glad you're the one who gets to answer it now. In what ways does leading through emergence contribute to organizational resilience and adaptability?
Mm. Yeah, very much. I think, I mean, emergence is about adaptability to change. It's responsiveness. It's not, so that's key. And flexibility enables sustainability. When we're rigid, we become like a watch spring that, I don't know if you remember the old days, you used to wind your watch and eventually it would get so
Mm,
tight and then you couldn't wind it anymore.
mm,
When we're rigid, we wind things up like that. We wind ourselves up. We become exhausted. Think about how exhausted you get just trying to control outcomes. If you had to have your attention on everything all the time, it's exhausting. Whereas if you
yeah.
can let go of 90% of stuff like Rajat Gupta does, you can breathe, you can flex, you can decide what needs your attention, what's important, what matters. So
Mm.
it very much does support resilience in organizations.
Mm. Now, my own question, not one of the ones that have been asked. When you've mentioned Gupta, I've remembered the assessment you made as do, and more responses came in. There were a
Mm,
multiple number of eights, and there was a four on it. I was at a nine, and I'm just thinking to myself, the progression from nine, wanting to solve everything, down to the
mm,
one, like Gupta
mm,
does. In your experience or in your opinion, how long does it take for a person to adapt to working from an
mm,
emergency point of view rather than an emergency point of view? How do we come
mm,
down from the nines and
mm,
the eights to a healthier level?
mm. Yeah, good. Again, I think it's the degree to which you're prepared to give it a go, practice, gather the evidence, and trust, and then apply the process. So it really is a function of the effort. I find in coaching, these days we do say 6 to 8 sessions of coaching. In the first
Mm,
3 to 4 sessions, people have gained a massive amount, and that can be over a 2 3 month period. So I think you can make massive gains over this in a very short time. 3 to 6 months, you can get yourself to that place. And I'm not saying you have to be a one. Sometimes it depends on your job or your level. If you're a project
mm,
manager, you probably more need to be at a 7 or 8. But if you're a CEO of a company that's doing more strategic stuff, you can afford to be at a one. Um,
mm,
and you need to calibrate for your role, your position, your context. But you certainly want to be experimenting and seeing where you can settle uh, more at a 4 than a 5 if you can, more at a 6 than a 7 if you can. And
mm,
yeah, and I think it can happen quickly if you and the beautiful thing is when you commit to something, life throws up some wonderful opportunities. So immediately you decide to do this, you'll get a challenge tomorrow and you go, no, I can't possibly try it on this one. And then you
mm.
go, yes, let's give it a go.
Oh,
And then you can
okay.
blame
Thank
me
you.
and say, I listened to this guy talk and you blame him, blame him.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. We will totally blame you, Neil. But now we know timeline is 3 to 6 months. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Mm, mm,
Second last question because of the time. So, how can leaders engage and motivate their teams to embrace a mindset geared towards I think we've answered this one. Emergence
mm.
rather than emergency. I think you've
Yeah,
answered this
yeah.
one. Sorry. I got mixed up a little bit there. Then now the quantitative bit of it, someone is asking, how then do leaders measure the effectiveness of their strategies in fostering emergence within the organizations versus emergency? How do we measure it?
Mm, mm. Well, I think those factors that we've talked about. So resilience. I'm sure there are all the factors: resilience, engagement, um, trust. All of these things will improve through an emergent approach, where people feel that they have more of a voice, more autonomy, more contribution. There's more flexibility, and ultimately, the way that when I do trust workshops around trust, is geared towards performance. Trust leads to better performance.
Mhm,
The key things in that Springbok team, if I go back to that, there's high levels of trust, and that leads to the performance. So ultimately, the same metrics, your performance metrics can increase, uh, and it will, and the ultimate outcomes as well. And I think it will contribute to a better triple bottom line.
mm,
Where you genuinely are putting other factors first and not just profit, which for me is something that I think is important.
Okay. Would you say that levels of wellness and well-being are also indicative of an organization or a team transitioning from emergency to emergence?
Very much. I mean, if you think everybody's an amygdala hijack, the wellness of that organization is not going to be good.
Mm,
And so 100% say it's linked to that.
thank you. Okay. Last one, and then I'll ask the last one. So, second
Mm,
last one again. How can leaders balance the need to address immediate crisis? I think this is someone recovering from the pandemic and the Red Sea issues end, while still fostering a culture of emergence. So, how do we balance it? I have a crisis. It's kind of
mm,
an emergency for real, but I don't want to react if I've
yeah.
understood the question correctly.
It's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked, because I should have made that point. Sometimes it is a crisis, and if it's a crisis, it's a crisis, but then it's a crisis.
Mm,
If a plane is falling out of the sky, that's a crisis. It's real, but
mm,
it's not an imagined crisis. And the distinction here is to recognize when we're treating it as a crisis, but it's not really, the building's not falling down, this is not the end of the world, versus when it is. So that's the other piece as well, is that it doesn't mean, there are real emergencies, there are real crises, but they're real, they're not imagined.
so tell the distinction, be distinct.
Mm, mm,
Okay.
mm,
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving us 12 extra minutes of your time.
mm,
My last question, Neil, to you. How do we reach you? If we want your support, we want your guidance as individuals and as teams on how to transition from
mm,
emergency to emergence. And I know you're also a performance coach and a team
mm.
leadership coach. So how do we reach you?
I kept a slide. I didn't know you were going to ask that question, but I have a slide, which I always just have at the end of my slideshows. So can I put that on?
Yeah.
It's got my contact details on it. There's my website, email address, and cell phone number in South Africa.
Mm.
So please screenshot that, and you're welcome to contact me.
All right. Can I post this on LinkedIn?
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay with you? Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
All righty.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you so
Great.
much.
Excellent.
Thank you so
Thanks so
much.
much, Nadine. I really appreciate it.
All right.
It was a great time. Thanks.
Thank you. Learned so much. Thank you so much,
Good.
Neil. And thank you, everyone who has been able to join us. And thank you to the ones who will be watching the recording or re-watching from the live event. To everyone, have a good balance of day from wherever it is that you are catching us from. Bye. Have a good evening.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Alrighty.